Okay, welcome. We're going to take a look at why do ethnicities have distinctive distribution. This is Rubenstein, Chapter 7, Key Issue 2. So, international migration of ethnicities. This is when we start to see slaves that are forced to migrate from Africa over to the New World. The first Africans arrive at America in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. So we're looking at the eastern seaboard of the United States, or then, which was just North America. 4,000 Africans are shipped during the 18th century to the United States. Nearly all slaves go to the United States, most of them to the Southwest. What are they doing down there? They're working the plantations, of course. 10 million Africans are forced to the Western hemispheres. That's a lot of people, ethnicities that are forced from Africa over to the entire Western hemispheres. So internationally, we're having a lot of travel. In 1808, the United States bans bringing slaves, but still we have over 250,000 people brought in illegally, forced to migrate. So we see the invention, the use of this slave trade here that's triangular. We have different European countries operating in various regions of Africa, and they send slaves to different places in the Americas. So we've got from Europe, we're traveling to Africa with goods. We're purchasing slaves, or we're taking slaves, and we're moving them over to the Caribbean or the Western Hemisphere. And then from the Caribbean, we're taking these slaves back, from the Caribbean, we're taking these spices and rum back to Europe. So this is the triangular slave trade in all these regions. Then we have voluntary migration from Latin America and Asia. So these people are not being forced, but they're still traveling internationally. The United States, initially, they had quota laws that limited immigrants from Latin America and Asia because the thought of the time was they wanted strictly people from the Western Europe region. They wanted white people. But then they decided that as far as a world or global outlook, these quota laws were quite racist and they needed more workers. So, I mean, they realized that they could get cheap labor from other areas of the globe. And so we started to remove those quota laws in the 1960s and 70s. So we saw that Hispanic and Asian population increase. Most of these people are low-wage workers coming in search of work. Now, we see that even more are children of immigrants. So we've got traditionally, if you remember, the average immigrant used to be a male traveling internationally because they could come over to the United States, get money, and send it back home. But then it switched over to females coming over to work, and now we see even children of immigrants coming over to work because they're bringing their families over. Hispanic people we see mainly from Mexico and Puerto Rico because those are the closest regions. Mexico because we can walk right across the borders there. Puerto Rico because this is a U.S. territory and we can gain access. But we still also have Asians from China, India, the Philippines, Korea, and Vietnam. Internal migration of African Americans within the United States. So internally within our country, we see migration of ethnicities. We speak about that first interregionally, moving from or between regions. After the Civil War, where we had turmoil in the South, we had discrimination in the South, we see ethnicities moving north to gain work on farms that they can work themselves as sharecroppers or to work in the businesses. During the early 20th century, they moved along by roads, car, and bus. And you start to see these patterns. How easy is it for ethnicities to travel on the highway systems that we built here in the United States? And so you see a pattern of internal migration based on these roads. For example, on the East Coast, we've got people moving from the Carolinas to the major cities of Philadelphia, New York, and Boston because they were using Route 1, which is now I-95. In East Central, you've got them moving from Alabama, Tennessee, all the way up to work in the factories of Detroit and Cleveland. Why? Well, because there's not necessarily work down here, because back then there was a lot of work in Detroit and Cleveland. They were moving along routes 25 and 21, which is now I-77. And if you drive, or if your family's gone on road trips, you will recognize that these are interstate highway systems and make it very easy to travel quickly. In the West, you've got people moving from Mississippi up to Chicago and St. Louis, which are major centers of industry, which we discussed later on. These are going along what is now I-55. And then, of course, from the southwest, we're going from Texas all the way along Interstate 10, Interstate 20, to Los Angeles and San Francisco, which are major cities of industry and work on the West Coast. We look at intra-regional migration within regions. Looking at Baltimore City, for example, migration within cities. You've got ethnicities that cluster all in one neighborhood, where we began to see the formation of places which were deemed ghettos, where you have a very dense population, sometimes in not very many kilometers here, that you have lots of population. They're crammed into a small area. So initially, you had ethnicities moving to the middle of these cities and staying with each other because of chain migration. People want to live with the same people of their own demographic because they know each other. They want to support each other. But because that's where the jobs were. So ethnicities are moving in because of jobs. During the 1950s and 60s, as populations increase, as jobs increase, you see the ghettos expand out. For example, here in Baltimore City, you've got more people coming in for jobs. It starts to be less affordable to move to the suburbs because housing continues to inflate in price. So ethnicities still move into the cities because, again, that's where the jobs are, that's where they can afford to work. This is where you really start to see the issue of white flight. This is where white people would leave areas on the edge of the city, close to the suburbs or even in the suburbs, because the fear was built up of ethnicities moving to your neighborhood. And realtors would even take advantage of this fear. They would encourage blockbusting, where they would tell whites to sell their homes for cheap because they didn't want ethnicities moving into their neighborhood. Because as everybody knows, ethnicities could be scary. At least that's how they would push the price increase. So they would convince white people to sell cheaply, and then they would raise the prices on the houses, getting major profits for the ethnicities moving in, thus creating white flight, where more and more white people would move out of the city centers to the suburbs where they could feel more safe, in quotes, theoretically, and ethnicities would move in to the cities, building up more and more of this segregation. And this is really important because when we talk about segregation through the study of demographics in human geography, this is one of the major places where it starts to occur, where we have the separation clearly of ethnicities. Specifically in Detroit, in the early 20th century, we have African Americans moving in for auto industry jobs. Of course, this is Detroit. Whites move out. We see the white population drop from, it drops by 1.5 million in 1950, between 1950 and 2000. The overall population dropped from 2 million to 700,000 because honestly, we used to have the auto unions and they were losing the ability to pay workers their union rate. So whites were losing their jobs. They were moving out of the central city districts, and we would have some ethnicities coming in to take their place. But at the same time, overall, we're losing jobs. So we see that in Detroit, we're getting that population drop. We look at the segregation by ethnicity and race. Of course, in the United States, we've got that separate but equal law, which the Supreme Court upholds in Plessy versus Ferguson back in 1896. This is where we started to see the legal separation of ethnicity. Specifically, it was black and white in the United States. And after the Civil War, although we ended slavery, we still saw segregation in the South through the creation of unofficial Jim Crow laws that were not necessarily backed by the Supreme Court, where you had blacks, they were forced to sit in the back of buses, in shops, restaurants, and hotels. They could say, you know what, we're only serving white people. And legally, you had the separation of schools where you would have whites went to one school, and usually it was backed well financially, and blacks or ethnicities going to another school that really wasn't backed very well at all financially. So there was a huge problem with segregation, according to ethnicity and race. So in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education officially eliminated segregation, such as these that we've discussed, in Topeka, Kansas, because they said that racial separation led to inferior education. Like, okay, maybe there was separate but equal according to the law, but when you look at it, the schools that ethnicities had were not up to the same standard as white people. So they eliminated that. They said that is not legal. But even today, you still see cultural segregation of ethnicities. For example, in Detroit, you've got the Detroit Institute of the Arts, where really it's just white European art. And then you have the Museum of African American History, which is this huge, beautiful exhibit, but it's all about Africans. It's all about the exhibit of people from that continent. So you still have this segregation going on in the country of ethnicities and races. We look specifically at the country of South Africa and how they went through the enormous issue of apartheid. This is where you had the physical separation of races into different geographical areas during the late 20th century. What they did is they classified babies from black, white, mixed, and Asian. And they said that each race had a different legal status and job. Pretty much they eliminated black jobs completely. They paid them way less. They limited their jobs, and they could not vote. So they really took a lot of the power completely away from the black population. They moved blacks to homelands where they segregated them. They put them in one area, which, to be honest, although it wasn't a governmental policy, you think about it in the United States, where you had ethnicities moving to the city center and you had whites moving out to the suburbs. It wasn't like a governmental policy in the United States, but it's kind of a similar thing that happened in South Africa. We have the separation by area. In 1991, South Africa decided to repeal this apartheid policy. And in fact, you saw Nelson Mandela released from prison after being in there for 27 years. Nelson Mandela was a proponent of ending apartheid, and they kept him in prison for all this time. And in 1994, they elected Mandela as the first black president. So you definitely saw the end of apartheid and separation there. So that's a look at Chapter 7, Key Issue 2. We're coming from the textbook Introduction to Human Geography, the Cultural Landscape, 11th edition by James Rubenstein.